But the music played on. New Orleans became the first center of jazz, with honky-tonk clubs popping up all over Storyville, the city's red light district. Because black musicians were not allowed to play in proper establishments like their white counterparts, jazz became associated with brothels and other less reputable venues. In 1917, the U.S. Navy, fearing for the health and safety of sailors who frequented the jazz clubs, shut them down. The same year, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, an all-white group from New Orleans, cut the first jazz record, bringing the music to a national audience and opening the door for sound-alike white bands to cash in on the jazz scene. As jazz's popularity grew, so did campaigns to censor the devil's music. Early detractors like Thomas Edison, inventor of the phonograph, ridiculed jazz, saying it sounded better played backwards. A Cincinnati home for expectant mothers won an injunction to prevent construction of a neighboring theater where jazz would be played, convincing a court that the music was dangerous to unborn babies. By the end of the 1920s, at least 60 communities across the nation had enacted laws prohibiting jazz in public dance halls. While the critics and the courts failed to silence jazz, the growing demand for labor following World War I managed to expand its influence. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans fled the South to find work in industrial cities in the North during the war. Artists need an audience, so musicians from New Orleans and other southern cities flocked north as well, bringing jazz with them. Chicago became the new center of jazz, with more than 100 clubs dotting the city's south side. The advent of Prohibition in 1920 brought jazz into gangster-run nightclubs, the only venues that served alcohol and hired black musicians. Whites and blacks began mixing socially for the first time in clubs of Chicago. White youth from all social classes were drawn to jazz and the seductive new dances that went along with it. With the help of the monkey glide, the turkey trot, and the Charleston, they were moved by the music, figuratively and literally. This newfound physical freedom, combined with the illicit mix of races and the widespread belief that jazz stimulated sexual activity, caused critics of jazz to step up their efforts. But the reformers couldn't fight progress. Jazz recordings allowed the music to reach beyond the nightclubs. New York radio and recording companies began to dominate the music industry, replacing Chicago as the center of jazz. In the 1920s, the black arts movement known as the Harlem Renaissance began, solidifying the city's position at the epicenter of African American culture. Although jazz was an important part of this movement, not all blacks were fans of the music, including W.E.B. Du Bois, a leader of the Harlem Renaissance, who was said to prefer Beethoven and Negro spirituals to jazz. The 1920s also marked the self-coronation of the King of Jazz, a white bandleader named Paul Whiteman. Although many blacks and whites criticized Whiteman for co-opting and sanitizing jazz, his recordings, which linked his sound to European symphonic music, sold millions. While Whiteman was getting rich, Louis Armstrong, the true jazz genius, arrived in New York City, where he played to a smaller but loyal audience of fans and fellow musicians who understood that they were witnessing a new revolution in jazz. Armstrong soon emerged as a star attraction, achieving popular success on the New York stage. Although his fan base was well established by the end of the decade, Armstrong's record company suggested he change suggestive lyrics to avoid offending his white audiences. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s was a period of cultural flourishing for African Americans, with jazz playing a central role. However, as jazz became more commercialized, particularly in the white-dominated entertainment industry, tensions arose over its representation and ownership. The commercialization of jazz during this period often diluted its cultural significance, leading to further debates about its origins and true meaning. Another point of contention is the question of authenticity in jazz. As jazz spread globally and became more commercialized, it evolved in various ways, incorporating elements from different musical traditions. Some purists argue that certain forms of modern jazz have strayed too far from its original roots, losing the essence of what made jazz unique. This raises questions about what can be considered true jazz and who has the authority to define it. But is jazz black music? When the genre first came into the spotlight about 100 years ago, many whites called it jungle music, or simply noise. But as time went on and jazz gained recognition worldwide, whites exaggerated their input, often outright claiming that blacks stole the music from them. In 1915, while touring the vaudeville circuit, New Orleans native Freddie Keppard was offered an opportunity to make what would have been the first ever jazz recording. For reasons still disputed, he declined the offer from the Victor Recording Company. 2 years later, the original Dixieland Jazz Band traveled to New York and recorded 2 sides for Victor, both of which took the nation by storm. To attract attention, the band was promoted as the creators of jazz. Nick LaRocca, leader of the band, was quoted as saying, "Our music is strictly white man's music. My contention is that the Negroes learned to play this rhythm and music from the whites. The Negro did not play any kind of music equal to white men at any time." The original Dixieland Jazz Band did in fact have a major impact on early jazz. The band helped spread the genre to households across the country. But to be clear, they weren't the creators. In fact, the genres that laid the blueprint for what would become jazz had already existed for decades. Danny Barker was an important figure in New Orleans jazz history. He outlived most of his contemporaries and was able to publish multiple books and give countless interviews in his lifetime. In one of these interviews, he commented on LaRocca's claim that blacks stole jazz from whites. "I noticed Nick LaRocca. He played a type of jazz which is not the same as King Oliver's jazz. It's diluted. If you notice, the Dixieland records are speeded up. Rarely would a white band play a series of low-down blues tunes. They don't have the blues like a Negro has because they've never been oppressed like that. They say they created jazz? No, they created their style of jazz." Jazz has evolved through various styles, including Dixieland, swing, bebop, and fusion, each adding new elements and pushing the boundaries of the genre. The story of jazz is a rich tapestry woven from diverse cultural influences and marked by continual innovation. From its roots in the African American communities of southern United States to its status as a global phenomenon, jazz has always been a reflection of the human spirit's creativity and resilience. Today, jazz is a global phenomenon, with vibrant jazz scenes in cities around the world. The internationalization of jazz has led to new interpretations and innovations, but it has also sparked debates about the genre's authenticity and its connection to its roots. The origins of jazz are as complex and multifaceted as the genre itself. While there is no doubt that jazz was born out of the African American experience, it was also shaped by a diverse array of cultural influences. The controversies surrounding the origins of jazz reflect broader issues of cultural identity, appropriation, and ownership. As jazz continues to evolve, these debates will likely persist, underscoring the genre's enduring significance in both American and global culture. This is One Track Jazz. Thanks for listening. You can listen to part 1 of this video by clicking the link in the description, and don't forget to like and subscribe.